He handed me divorce papers at my father's funeral. I signed them. 2 days later, he learned the one thing he thought he could take. He had no legal claim to my father's estate. If protecting yourself from financial abuse matters to you, please consider subscribing. This channel is where I share what I learned so you can spot the signs sooner than I did. We had been careful, I thought. Brian and I kept our own accounts, mostly, at least on paper. We joked about team money and my little spreadsheet, like it was endearing. He liked to buy me flowers when he remembered anniversaries. He laughed too loud at my jokes, and he could be charming in a way that made people lean in. He was also someone who worked late sometimes, came home smelling like a cologne I didn't recognize, and had a way of answering my questions with a deflection instead of an explanation. The first crack appeared in the most ordinary place, my inbox. A late June morning, the sky the kind of pale blue that makes you think of ocean glass and not danger. A billing alert from a bank I'd never used. Capital Reserve Platinum, account activity, $8,400. My stomach went cold before my mind could assemble anything. I called customer service. The voice on the other end was patient, the kind that reads tears and flags. To open that card, the application required a signed authorization and 2 security answers, she said. Plain facts, like a detective making a list. It lists a different mailing address and several large purchases in electronics and a landscaping company. There's a surreal quality to reading other people's charges when they're listed under your name. Names feel like keys. Here was one with a lock I had not given anyone. The statement said Capital Reserve Platinum in the header, and under it, numbers, dates, a balance that in one breath made me physically sick. $8,400. Someone had used my identity to open credit, to commit a fraud I couldn't yet name. I remember the sound of the microwave timer clicking off as I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug gone cold. The apartment smelled like last night's takeout. Brian's jacket, his coat that he always left on the back of his office chair, hung like it had done for years. I thought of asking him. I thought of confronting him. But before I could move, a text appeared from my father. "Can you come to breakfast? Dad. Don't tell Brian." My father, Jason Hart, was an electrician by trade. Call his hands, a laugh that stole the oxygen from a room, a man who learned early how to fix things, and then discovered later that not everything broken wanted fixing. He lived 2 towns over in the house we all grew up in. He called at odd hours for little reasons, to tell me about a squirrel in the attic, about a neighbor's new dog, or to remind me to get my oil changed. This text landed like a hand on my shoulder. His instruction, "Don't tell Brian," was a small thing with a large thrum of significance. If Dad didn't want Brian to know, there was a reason. My mind assembled possibilities from years of living in a marriage where secrecy could mean selfishness. In Dad's world, secrecy often meant protection. I told no one. I ate a bagel with more focus than appetite and drove the 30 minutes to his diner. He was at the corner booth, a thermos of 2 strong coffee warming between his hands. He looked older that morning, the kind of older that didn't happen overnight, but at once does. "You look worried," he said without waiting to be asked. I told him about the card. I gave him the bare facts. Capital Reserve Platinum, $8,400, new mailing address. He listened like he'd been trained to gather evidence instead of comfort. When he spoke, he did so in the slow, certain way of someone who had made hard decisions before. "I've made arrangements," he said. "I need you to go to Eleanor's. Go now. Don't bring Brian." There it was, the word again. Don't bring Brian. My throat tightened. I thought of the possibilities and tried to weigh them without falling into panic. I asked him why. He answered with a small, tight smile and the same kind of stubborn calm he put on when a fuse needed replacing. "Just go," he said. "This is my mess. Let me try to fix it." Eleanor Hartwell was more than a name on a door. She had been our family's quiet guardian when it came to the boring but vital things. Wills, property titles, the paperwork lighthouse that people ignore until storms come. Her office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon disinfectant. She didn't have the theatricality of a television lawyer. Instead, she had the even tone of someone who'd seen what panic and poor planning could do and wanted to prevent both. She led me into a small conference room and set a thick folder on the table, fingers steepled like she was about to explain a complicated piece of furniture, and instead would hand me a manual. Her eyes were direct. "Jason did this because he wanted you to be safe," she said. "He executed an irrevocable trust 3 days before he passed." Those words, 3 days before he passed, came like a blow in a place I hadn't thought to protect. My father had died 2 mornings earlier. The funeral would be in a week. That morning, sitting across from Eleanor, I felt the world rearrange itself under my feet.
An irrevocable trust, she explained, is a legal arrangement where assets are transferred into a trust and the terms can't easily be changed. It's designed to protect the assets from outside claims, creditors, lawsuits, even sometimes claims by a spouse. Once it's funded and signed properly, it limits the ability of someone else to access or take those assets. Her voice translated dense legal work into plain English. You don't need to be a lawyer to understand the shelter effect. It's like moving your valuables from a chain-link fence yard into a fenced room with a steel door.
People can argue about the chain link and the fence, but the door is closed. Eleanor slid photocopies of documents across the table, pages stamped, initialed, signatures in black ink. The trust listed properties: the old house on Maple where Dad had installed the porch he always bragged about, a small commercial property on 4th Street, assorted savings accounts, a list of investment accounts, and a note about an old tool shop he'd rented out. The trust named me as the sole beneficiary and contained a clause that excluded spousal claims, an explicit legal move to prevent a partner from asserting rights to the trust's assets. I stared at the list of properties and at a line item that caught my breath, a notice from a county clerk about a civil filing connected to the 4th Street property. The figure attached to it, $47,000, was in bold ink on a tear sheet. It read like an accusation: unpaid obligations, a sublease gone wrong, a landlord-tenant dispute that had turned into litigious teeth. Someone had taken advantage of an old arrangement, or more than someone. The paper didn't say who, it only said owed. Why now? I asked, and the world narrowed to a single question. Why the trust? Why secrecy? Why him? Eleanor leaned back. Your father suspected a pattern, she said. He'd noticed odd things: accounts opened in names without authorization, payments that didn't make sense. He wanted to make sure if anything happened to him, you wouldn't be left to scramble. He had the documents drafted and funded. The trust was signed and notarized, and the funding transfers were completed 72 hours before he died. 72 hours. The number felt like both a shield and a timestamp. I tried not to think about what had happened in those 72 hours. What fights, what decisions, what last conversations. Instead, the facts offered a small gift: my father's willful, deliberate act to protect me, to move assets out of reach of people who might try to take them. Why not tell me? I asked. Because it might have made him a target sooner, Eleanor said. People change their behavior when they know what they're facing. He wanted to keep the plan quiet. There was relief braided with grief. Relief because my name was on the trust, and not because my father's intentions were any less mortal or fraught. Grief because I had lost him, and a new sharp anxiety because secrecy that protects can also reveal secrets. Secrets about who had been looking too closely at our family's affairs. When I left Eleanor's office, the folder felt heavier than paper. Dad had left an envelope he wanted me to have with other things inside. It was sealed with a post-it note in his handwriting. For Jessica, read if anything happens to me. I carried that envelope like a talisman through the hospital parking lot, where we'd sign the organ donation papers, and that last set of forms. Things you only ever sign when life narrows into logistics. The next days blurred into a rhythm of calls and condolences, of hands squeezing my shoulders in church basements, and a black suit that never fit right. At the funeral, people came to remind me of my father's generosity and of the way he could make the fluorescent light in a church like afternoon. Pastor Williams spoke in the kind voice of someone who'd been a neighbor for decades and had seen my father teach Sunday school and teach kids to tie knots for the youth group. People whispered about his toolbox left in the garage, a bench full of grease and memories. There were children with crayon drawings of the man who fixed their bicycles, couples who remembered him wiring a kitchen, tenants who called him Mr. Hart. The room was full of people whose lives he had kept steady by doing small, steady things. Under the polite condolences and the coffee urn, the folder from Eleanor sat in my handbag like an ember. I slept in fits, and when I woke, I read and reread the trust provisions, so the legal language would stop feeling like a foreign tongue. The trust named me outright as sole beneficiary. It listed the properties, the accounts, and a phrase that meant more than the words: to be held for the benefit of Jessica Hart in perpetuity. It contained a clause that limited my immediate distribution for long-term stewardship. It also set terms for a successor trustee, someone to protect the assets if I was unable. The trust's bedueling, as Eleanor explained on the phone, was the opposite of a quick cash-out. It was designed to preserve. I began to notice things that had been invisible, changes in Brian's behavior, a defensiveness that had the texture of someone used to being backed into corners. He asked about the estate exactly once, in a public way that I remember.
at the visitation, leaning close as if the words required less volume. "Your dad was always looking out for you," he said. His voice was flat with the kind of moderation that meant rehearsed. "I hope we can figure out whatever needs figuring." The fact that he asked about the estate at all should have been a small red flag. Instead, I heard what I wanted to hear, concern. But my father's implicit warning, "Don't tell Brian," hung between us like a curtain. I kept my silence about the trust. I kept the envelope in the top drawer of my dresser beneath a stack of old tax records. When anyone asked if Dad had made arrangements, I said, yes, he did, and then a polite, evasive paragraph about how I was processing things. I also began to dig, not out of suspicion so much as to answer the practical questions of stewardship. What did the properties need? Were the accounts solvent? What were the obligations attached? As the executor of my own life, I owed myself and my father's legacy that investigation. One morning, I found a stack of mail in the old house's kitchen, unopened letters shoved behind a magnetized calendar.
Among them was a notice from a neighbor who ran a shop on 4th Street, complaining about a subtenant who had been running an unlicensed business out of the back of the property and not paying rent. There was a letter from a contractor who said he hadn't been paid. There was an eviction notice, stamped with a county seal, listing $47,000 as the sum owed. The arithmetic of neglect doesn't look like a mystery, it looks like an account. It started to make a kind of terrible sense. The 4th Street property had been a small investment Dad had picked up years ago, a place he rented out to a small business owner who'd promised care and upkeep. Over time, promises frayed. Rentals were subleased in ways that weren't allowed. Money that should have been collected as rent evaporated. Repairs went unmade. If someone had been slipping invoices through or arranging for deposits to be diverted, it would present as a steady leak until the reservoir was low. I wanted to call Brian and ask him bluntly if he'd ever been involved in any of this. I wanted to ask if he'd ever seen a capital reserve bill, if he'd ever answered security questions for any of the bank accounts. In the back of my mind, a cold suspicion kept surfacing, like a slowly rising tide. But I had no evidence, only the twinge of late nights and the smell of cologne. Evidence matters, that's what I kept telling myself. If you accuse and you can't prove it, you lose the story before you start. So I began to gather the things that would become proof. I made copies of all the paperwork in the house, I took pictures of notices, and I brought a stack of documents to Eleanor's office. She agreed that the pattern looked troubling, and she recommended a private investigator, someone who could compile facts without the partialities of family feeling. Eleanor gave me a name, Marcus Chin. She spoke his name with a kind of professional approval. When she said his name, her shoulders relaxed just a fraction, like a woman passing a heavy parcel to a trusted porter. Marcus's office was cluttered with calendars and an old map of the county, pins stuck in places a storyteller might choose to pin characters. He listened without judgment as I recounted late nights, the strange charges, the mail, the $47,000 notice. He nodded. It could be identity theft, he said. It could be something more organized. Either way, what you want is a paper trail and proof. We'll look for who has access, who has signed, who benefited. We did not know then what the paper trail would lead to. I still held on to the hope that it would be a clerical error, a bank mistake that could be corrected with a phone call and an apology. There is a kind of wishful thinking that acts like a soft blanket over the hard facts, an attempt to keep grief warm and scam cold. But the more I collected, the less comforting the pattern looked.
There was a receipt for a landscaping company, charged to Capital Reserve, the same landscaping company that had done work on our cul-de-sac. There were electronics purchases, screens and tools, that did not reflect my life. The signature lines raised a question. Someone had supplied answers to security questions that only a close person might know. To open a line of credit in your name typically requires either your physical signature or answers to personal questions, your mother's maiden name, the name of your first pet. Those are small, secret things. They are the keys to identities. I remember a night sitting on my father's porch with Eleanor's photocopies spread out like weathered leaves on the picnic table. There was a moth trapped in the porch light, and the sound of the neighbor's television through the thin house walls. In the dark, it felt less like I was reading documents, and more like I was translating a life. People who commit identity theft like that are usually someone nearby, Eleanor said. They need access to information. If someone can answer security questions, they likely have been in your family's orbit. I thought of Brian's late nights and his odd questions about my father's investments. I thought of the way he had been unusually curious about the 4th Street property when I mentioned it in passing. But suspicion is not proof, and I was not going to cast accusations into the open air with facts to weigh them down. Dad called me the evening before his funeral in a voice that sounded like it had been through a storm. He coughed twice and then said, "I did what I could, Jess. I couldn't have everyone know. I wanted you to have time to breathe after the funeral." He laughed, a soft thing that was partly apology. "You did a lot," I said. "You did enough." "No," he said, more gravely. "I did what I could. Be careful. They like to look small, but they can take a lot." I didn't ask who they were. The word could mean a bank or a bad promise. It could mean a person. With my father's passing, the veil between what we could control and what we could not had shifted. His trust, his last careful legal act, had created a space of protection and a set of new duties. Preparation for the funeral became an exercise in mechanical kindness, arranging flowers, writing a speech that kept choking me, sitting through hymns that made me think of power tools humming in a garage. I read the envelope from Dad sometimes like a talisman, though it was closed, and I had promised myself I wouldn't open it until later. On the morning of the funeral, the church smelled of lilies and coffee, a combination of sacred and ordinary. People came and they told stories of how my father had helped them, a rewiring done for free, a light fixed, a small loan when a tire exploded. In those stories, my father was steady and practical, someone who turned his skill into gestures that held people together.
Brian stood in the back of the receiving line, looking like someone who'd pressed himself into one of those borrowed suits and hoped the fabric could hold the story. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't parse, one that might have been grief, might have been calculation, might have been tired performance. People hugged and told me how sorry they were. I smiled in a way that felt foreign, a practiced expression. There was a moment between the end of the service and the reception where the room thinned. I had a coffee pressed into my hand and reached for the envelope in the drawer of my purse. The paper felt both thin and important. There was a photograph inside, a picture of Dad with a crooked grin, standing in the yard of the maple house, the sun making a halo around his profile. Beneath it, a note in his handwriting, "Look after them. Not everything is about money." I folded the photograph into my palm like a prayer, thinking of what he meant. Not everything is about money. For him, legacy had always been people first. Tenants who needed a fair rent, neighbors who needed a helping hand. Yet he had also known that money can be weaponized, that an unscrupulous person can use paper and banks to turn a lifetime of care into chaos. At the reception, people clustered in groups, trading stories, offering casseroles and promises to call. Eleanor sat a few tables over with a small notebook, her expression steady. I crossed the room and sat down heavily. The air was thick with syrupy coffee and the clink of plastic cups. It was there, 2 hours after I'd been at Eleanor's office, and days after I'd sworn to keep the trust quiet, that Brian approached with a folder in his hand. He had gone to the restroom, he said, then returned with a manila envelope. He told me, in a voice meant to be small and considerate, that he had filed a petition. The words were ordinary. I filed for divorce. I thought it was better to be straightforward. The room hummed like a refrigerator. For a suspended second, nothing else existed. Not the casseroles, not the faces, not the photograph in my hand. My body knew how to respond to jolts, heat in the throat, the world tilting, but my mind tried to make sense of the logistics. Filing a divorce is a legal act that begins a process. Someone had done it, and in that moment, the act felt like an ambush disguised as a procedural step. He handed me the papers with the quiet of someone attempting kindness. "I thought you'd want to know," he said. There are moments where time compacts so tight that it hurts. I took the folder. I slid my thumb under the paper and felt the weight of pages that had been prepared in advance. My signature, if I put it down, would be more than ink. It would be a marker in a process designed to separate lives, to judicially divide what had been shared. I did not sign then. What mounted in me was not a desire for drama, but a need for calculation. The trust Eleanor had put in place 3 days before my father's death had functioned on a legal level that was precise and not beholden to grief. I had the documents, I had the copies. Doing what my father had planned would require patience and perhaps a refusal to perform for someone else's convenience. Yet grief is not a rational state. Standing there with the funeral bustle around me, The man I had shared a life with handed me a choice between a public paper and a private protection he had not known about. The position of power and the position of grief collided in a single jagged instant. I folded the folder closed and set it on the table in front of me like a shield. People kept coming over to lay hands on my shoulder and say, "I'm sorry." I learned then a kind of small, private clarity. The tools my father had given me, Eleanor's calm, the irrevocable trust, a stack of photocopies, were not replacements for the wound of loss, but they were scaffolding for the steps I would have to take next. That afternoon, I went back to the house and paced the rooms Dad had fixed for us over the years. In the garage, his tool box was precisely arranged, like a row of soldiers standing at attention. I found my phone light and took a single photograph of the workbench. I texted Marcus, asking him to start. I told Eleanor I needed her advice about the 4th Street notices. I called a friend and asked her to come by that evening. When night fell, I sat alone with the envelope from Dad and the photographs from the trust. The pages whispered with the quiet authority of things that had been sealed and then opened. The world outside the window was soft with rain. The pieces were assembling into a shape I could not yet name. I had suspicion, I had documents, and I had a father who, in his last practical thought, had tried to shield me from exactly this kind of harm. There was a dull ache in my chest that felt like the anticipation of being hurt again, as if the body knew an upheaval was coming and wanted to brace for it. I turned the pages of the photocopied trust once more, committing the property list to memory, noticing the clause excluding spousal claims, and reading the legalese until it smoothed into meaning. According to this, a spouse could not simply walk away with the assets named here. It wasn't invulnerability, but it was a strong lockbox. I slept badly and dreamt in fragments, a tool bench, a bank statement, the church hymn echoing like wind through pipes. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the phone buzzed with a message that would change everything. A short note from Eleanor that read simply, "Be at the church at noon. He filed the petition publicly." The words arrived in a small, sterile font and landed like a stone. My chest tightened with a mixture of fear, resolve, and something like the ferocious calm that comes when you know lines have been drawn. I grabbed Dad's photograph and the envelope and walked out into the rain, feeling the world contract into a handful of steps and a handful of breaths. The driveway smelled like wet gravel, and in the distance, a car horn sounded like a marker in a race. I did not yet know how the next hours would unfold. I only knew what Dad had done, and that I had work to do to honor the way he'd chosen to protect me. The church clock read 12 when the petition arrived like a small, hard object that knocked the air from my lungs. The reception room was full of the soft clatter of paper plates and the slow murmur of condolences. People moved in little circuits of grief, handing casseroles and hugs like currency. Brian came toward me with the folder open in his hand, the way someone offers a peace treaty. His face had that practiced expression again, the one that says, "I'm being reasonable, so you will not look too hard at what follows." "I filed," he said. "I thought you'd prefer I be honest about it." I remember the way his words were ordinary, as if divorce were another box to be checked off the day's errands. I remember the paper between his fingers, how the top page had been filled with typed lines and a space for a signature. There was a hush around us, people feeling awkward about the proximity of raw grief and legal process. When he set the folder in front of me, I felt suddenly exposed, as if 2 different parts of my life had been unstitched and laid on the same tablecloth. I had Eleanor's copies in my bag. I had the trust, the clause that forbade spousal claims, the notice about $47,000 on 4th Street, the photocopy of the Capital Reserve statement with $8,400 in suspicious charges. All of those papers had been folded around my heart for days. They were legal armor, precise and bureaucratic, not the sudden heat of a shouted argument. They were not a talisman against humiliation. He was soft then, almost coaxing. "Sign this, make it clean. I don't want us to have to." He broke the sentence as if grief were a social curve that needed smoothing for everyone's comfort. People watched. A few offered condolences. Someone patted my hand. A cousin I hadn't seen since college leaned in with a shoulder squeeze. The room was an audience of kindness and ignorance. I signed. I signed because in that moment it felt smaller than the other options. Refusing would have escalated the scene, brought a spectacle, prolonged that unnatural collision of mourning and legal procedure. Signing felt like folding the paper back into the pocket of a coat and pretending we could still walk home together. It was a dishonest comfort, and also a surrender born of tiredness.
The signature was an instinctive way to keep the peace in a room full of people who did not have the context of the trust and the work that began the moment my father's eyes closed. After I signed, Brian folded the papers and put them away like a man putting away a tool.
He offered a small, perfunctory "I'm sorry" and reached for my hand, as if apology could smooth the crease of what he'd done. I let him touch my fingers, long enough not to push him away. Grief can be a soft place for people to land bad behavior, and I had not yet learned the shape of righteous anger. 2 days later, the soft place hardened into legal reality. I had not told anyone about the trust beyond Eleanor and Marcus. The decision to keep it quiet had been my father's, and then mine. Not a secret to abuse, but a measure of protection. I remember sitting at the kitchen table in the old Hart house with the photocopies spread out, Marcus on a conference call with me and Eleanor listening in. Marcus had begun to turn his findings into a narrative: dates, names, locations, financial traces. "It isn't just a credit card," he said. "There's a paper trail that shows pattern. Accounts opened, mailing address changes, checks forwarded. Then there's the 4th Street sublease and the diverted payments. Someone made it look like legitimate payments went elsewhere." Marcus had photographs, blurred images from a security camera near 4th Street, showing a man carrying packages to a storage locker at odd hours. He had a set of emails, some messages between an email account registered to Vanessa Chin and an address traced to a forwarding service. He had voicemail transcriptions and a recording that took my breath away, a voice that sounded like Brian arguing with someone about taking care of the tenant and making sure the numbers came back right. The recording didn't contain every detail, but it contained tone and intent, precise, transactional, familiar. Marcus explained how he had obtained court-authorized subpoenas for some records and how with them he could trace certain transactions. The Capital Reserve Platinum application listed identifying answers that matched details someone close to our family would know. The card had been used for a set of purchases that corresponded to work done on 4th Street, and wire transfers had been routed through accounts that, when traced, led back to vendors who had dealt with the real estate agent Vanessa Chin. The pieces began to click together in a way that didn't feel like a story I had wanted to tell. It began to look, as Marcus said, organized. He mapped payments and recorded conversations. He showed a ledger of checks deposited in an account accessible to Vanessa. Eleanor sat quietly and took notes, her face that of someone accustomed to the dryness of paperwork and the wetness of human consequence. "We're going to package this for the DA said. Amanda will want all of this: emails, recordings, the photo timeline, the subpoenaed bank info. If there's a conspiracy here, we can show intent." Amanda Pierce, the prosecutor Marcus named, had a reputation for taking on white-collar cases with a methodical, no-flourish approach. She didn't like theatrics. She liked evidence, stacked so neatly it couldn't be ignored. Marcus and Eleanor compiled a binder of documents and sat with Amanda to explain the pattern: identity theft, fraud, diverted rents, and a scheme that targeted the 4th Street property. They connected the dots between the Capital Reserve account, the $8,400 balance, and a set of invoices that were never paid to contractors because funds had been routed elsewhere. The day the DA's office opened an investigation felt oddly like a confirmation and an escalation at once. Confirming meant someone in authority had accepted that our facts merited action. Escalation meant police interviews, subpoenas, and the public hum of legal process. Amanda told me plainly what I needed to expect: interviews, possible criminal charges, and the fact that these investigations take time. She used phrases that were clinical and reassuring in equal measure. "We will follow the money. We will subpoena relevant accounts. We will coordinate with federal agencies if necessary." One of the most difficult parts of the process was watching how quickly ordinary life became evidence. Bank statements, text messages, receipts, things that had once been private became objects to be examined and validated. People who had been background characters in our life, vendors, tenants, a contractor, were called to testify about checks and unpaid invoices. Marcus tracked down a canceled check that allegedly should have paid a contractor. The payee's account showed a deposit to a different business. When he produced the photos and the matching invoice numbers, the pattern looked less like a mistake and more like deliberate diversion. And then there were the recordings. The PI had legal ways to record conversations when probable cause existed,
and one of those recordings captured a phone call in which Vanessa Chin spoke of arranging a sublease and ensuring the operational money was directed where it needed to be. In another clip, a voice, identified later as Brian's by a forensic analyst, spoke in a tone of familiar certainty about making the house work and about covering the gaps. Forensic analysis of handwriting on documents showed similarities to forms filled in with security information. The forensic IT team matched IP addresses that suggested the account changes had been accessed from devices registered to numbers Brian used. All of this was delivered to the DA with restraint and rigor. Amanda and her team laid out a criminal complaint that alleged identity theft, wire fraud, and conspiracy. They corroborated Marcus's findings with bank investigators and subpoenaed email headers that linked Vanessa's address to the forwarding service used in the Capital Reserve application. The package was thorough. It was also devastatingly clinical. Criminality, when framed as a set of transactions and timestamps, loses some of its drama and gains in coldness. A grand jury returned indictments.
Arrest warrants were issued. Brian was arrested quietly at his job one morning, a plainclothes officer waiting and reading a short statement of rights. The knock at the apartment had been polite, not cinematic. He was handcuffed, read the charges, and led away. The sight of him in cuffs, the ordinary man who smelled like the cologne I couldn't identify, made something in me go very still and very sad. He had been a kind of presence in my life, familiar as dishes and as easily breakable. Seeing him arrested felt like the end of a long pageant where people had been pretending not to look. Vanessa was arrested a few weeks later after an interstate warrant was executed. She had tried to move and change locations to make herself scarce, but the paper trail followed. She too was charged and eventually convicted alongside Brian. The transcript of the case recorded convictions for both clients. The state presented bank records, the PI's recordings, email headers, and forensic handwriting analysis. There were elements that played like a slow, steady unraveling: witnesses who testified to diverted payments, a contractor who didn't get paid, tenants who said they had been promised one thing and delivered another. Derek, Brian's divorce attorney, filed the petition that had been served at the funeral. Derek's name, calm, professional, showed up in court filings as the petitioner's counsel. He was an actor in the legal drama, but not charged with crimes in the materials we presented. His presence in the story was as the legal professional representing Brian's immediate civil position. The DA's office focused on the criminal acts: identity theft, wire fraud, conspiracy. When the indictments came through, Amanda and her team coordinated with civil counsel to secure temporary orders to protect the trust assets from dissipation while criminal proceedings took their course. I kept an arm's length from delight about the convictions. The legal system had done its work, slow, heavy, and perfect, and people had been held to account. Amanda's prosecutorial files showed the evidence that the jury had relied upon. But what would matter most to me afterward was not the verdicts alone. It was what I did with what remained. After the arrests, community reaction was not the sensationalized anger I expected. People were empathetic, shocked, and in many cases quietly furious on my behalf. Pastor Williams called me and spoke about forgiveness and accountability in the same calm breath. He reminded me that justice and compassion can exist together. His words were not a call to forget, but an invitation to steer my grief into something that could serve others. Maria, who ran the bakery on the corner of Maple and 3rd, brought me a loaf of bread and told me stories, small things about my father, how he'd lent her money once when the oven went, how he'd come in on a Sunday and wire a loose light in her shop.
Curtis from down the block, who ran a small plumbing business, volunteered to help with repairs around the properties. The Johnson family, who had rented next door for years, came with casseroles and offered to host the first tenant meeting in their living room. I sat with all of them and with the trust documents and tried to figure out what stewardship meant in practice. My father's impulse had been to protect me from financial harm. My impulse after that was to protect his legacy from becoming a weapon. The irrevocable trust meant the assets were legally insulated from a spouse's claim, but it also meant I was responsible for preserving the properties for the long term. There was a clause about stewardship, about not liquidating quickly. Eleanor had made that clear from the start. The trust was a preservation tool, not a cash-out clause. At Marcus's suggestion and Eleanor's insistence, we initiated a civil suit to reclaim funds and enforce lease obligations connected to the 4th Street property. That suit sought unpaid rent, $47,000 as the notice had stated, and also sought an accounting from any party who had benefited from diverted payments.
Civil court moved slower in some ways, but it allowed us to demand specific documentation and pursue restitution. Through the civil process, we uncovered more invoices that had been misdirected, and a series of transactions that showed money moving through a handful of shell accounts before ending up with vendors tied to Vanessa's businesses. Watching the law work was both comforting and humiliating. It comforted me to see the mechanisms of accountability move, but it was humiliating in the sense that my family's privacy had been splayed out as exhibits. Bank statements tacked to a board, email headers underlined in court papers, a credit application blown up on a screen in a deposition. Yet from those raw, exposed pieces, something began to be rebuilt. Once the immediate legal threat had been contained, arrests made and assets secured under court order, I turned my attention to the people who had been the real, quiet focus of my father's life. The tenants of the Maple House and the businesses on 4th Street were not a balance sheet to be emptied. They were neighbors who fed my father's sense of purpose. He believed in keeping rents fair, in making small loans when someone was between paychecks, in fixing a leaking roof without asking for reimbursement because community mattered more than profit. The first step in rebuilding was practical. There were necessary repairs: a leaking roof over the maple porch, a sagging gutter at the bakery, a back door that wouldn't lock. Curtis came with his toolbox and an energy that felt like a renewed version of my father's practical love. He fixed what needed fixing and taught me how to prioritize maintenance in a way that preserved value and dignity. We established a simple financial model for the properties.
Half of the rental income would go to ongoing maintenance and a reserve fund for repairs. The other half would be allocated to community programs managed by the foundation we created, the Jason and Sarah Hart Foundation. My father's name, Jason, was the anchor. The foundation name honored both of his generosity and my mother's quiet stewardship. Sarah had always been the organizing force beside him. The foundation's mission was twofold: keep the housing and small business rents reasonable, and launch programs that taught financial literacy, tenant rights, and emergency assistance. Our first meeting, a tenant gathering held in the Johnson family's living room, was small and tentative. I sat with a notebook and a stack of photocopies showing the trust structure and our immediate plans. Maria brought pastries. Curtis set up a small projector. People came with guarded questions. Would rents increase? Would evictions start? Would we sell the properties to a developer who would raise prices and push people out? My answers were blunt and steady. We were not a developer. My father's trust was a preservation tool by design. I told them the model: maintain the properties, subsidize for those in need, teach people how to protect themselves financially. We launched our first workshop 2 months after the convictions. It began as a modest thing, an afternoon in the church basement with coffee, flyers, and handouts. We called it Money That Protects, Practical Steps for Women, because the pattern that had attacked us, identity theft and quietly diverted funds, disproportionately affects people who put trust in partners or have been targeted because of caregiving roles. The workshop covered basics: reading a bank statement, recognizing unfamiliar accounts, securing passwords, keeping an eye on mail, and where to go when you suspect fraud. Marcus gave a session on how PIs gather evidence lawfully. Eleanor taught the legal basics of trusts and wills in plain English. I taught what I had learned the hard way about paying attention to small anomalies. Dozens of women showed up that first afternoon: neighbors, friends, women from Pastor Williams' congregation, a young mother who brought her toddler in a car seat, and their questions were sharp and searching. How do I check if someone opened a credit line in my name? Asked a woman named Tanya. Who can I call if my mail is forwarded? Asked another. We offered free credit checks, a list of legal resources, and a one-time emergency grant for people who had nowhere to turn for essential bills. The numbers mattered less than the faces. Women who had been invisible suddenly felt seen and protected. The workshop wasn't meant to be a panacea. It was an armor stand where we gave out pieces of protection people could wear home. We also established a small emergency rental fund managed by the foundation.
The fund was meant for short-term crises, unexpected medical bills, temporary job loss, so tenants wouldn't be forced into desperate choices that predatory agents or unscrupulous partners could exploit. The first requests we funded were modest but meaningful: a week of rent covered for a single mother while she waited for a paycheck, a contractor payment fronted so a small business could keep its doors open, a utility bill paid so a family wouldn't be plunged into darkness. Those acts were small, practical continuations of what my father had always done: keep people's lights on. The foundation approach was designed to be transparent. We published monthly reports summing rental income, maintenance expenditures, and the amounts dispersed for programs. Eleanor oversaw compliance and the structure of the trust, so that the stewardship would not fall prey to the same opportunistic hands that had drafted schemes against us. Marcus stayed on in a part-time consulting capacity, teaching tenants how to spot suspicious activity and training volunteers to do basic document checks.
The Johnson family turned their living room into a makeshift classroom and a weekly meeting spot. Curtis led a workshop on home maintenance and tenant-landlord communication. Maria offered to teach budgeting classes using pastries as an incentive. Pastor Williams hosted a forum where tenants could ask legal questions and hear from community organizations about mental health support. We partnered with a local credit union to offer low-fee checking accounts and small emergency loans at favorable terms. The community we built around the properties felt like an answer to the question my father had posed in that note. Look after them. There were hard conversations along the way. People asked about the money that had been stolen and wanted to know if it would be recovered. The civil suit helped recover a portion of misdirected funds, and the $47,000 owed was partially recovered through settlement and restitution orders. The criminal convictions led to court-ordered restitutions were available, though those paid orders rarely make the whole victim whole. We used what could be reasonably recovered to replenish the emergency fund and to pay contractors who had been left unpaid. It was not justice in a poetic sense. It was accounting and reparation as much as the law allowed. Through all of this, I carried the letter from my father with me, the one he'd sealed with a post-it that told me to read if anything happens. I didn't open it at once. I kept it as one keeps a hymn book, close at hand for a moment when you need it. When I finally broke the seal, his handwriting folded over the paper like a worn tool handle. Short sentences about pride and love, about responsibilities, and names to call if something went wrong. Be careful, he wrote, but be bolder than you think. Help people. Don't let the hurt make you small.
It was that last line, "Don't let the hurt make you small," that became a litmus test for decisions. Keeping rents reasonable despite the allure of liquidating assets, helping neighbors instead of investors, hiring local contractors instead of the cheapest bid. Those were ways to meet my father's intention for stewardship. They were not always easy. There were days the paperwork made me feel as if grief had been morphologically transformed into a job description. There were nights when I woke and replayed the image of the petition being handed to me in a room full of people who had come to mourn. Brian's prison letter arrived after he had been sentenced. I read it with my hands steady because part of me had wanted a theatrical confrontation and another part simply wanted the truth. He wrote in a small, cramped hand, lines that bent to squeeze more words onto the page, as if every line required contrition to fill it up. "I am writing because I can't find the right way to say it in person," he began. "I don't expect forgiveness. I want you to know I thought I'd protect our future, and instead I betrayed you and your family. I was greedy. I was ashamed. I was wrong." He went on to detail in halting sentences how things had happened in ways that felt Vanessa that shifted into something transactional. The way he kept his ledger of excuses and then used the ledger to justify stealing the very thing he said he loved. He admitted he had opened accounts in my name, provided the answers to security questions, and rerouted payments. He admitted to conspiring with Vanessa to shuffle money from the 4th Street rents into accounts that were not for maintenance. His letter admitted the harm, which is not the same as remorse that heals. He wrote, "I am sorry for the humiliation. I'm sorry for the betrayal. I wish I could take it back." There was a paragraph in which he acknowledged the impact on the people who had been victims indirectly, the contractors who hadn't been paid, the tenants who had threats of eviction, the community that had trusted my father. Reading it, I felt waves of things: anger that had grown into acceptance, sorrow for the man I had loved once, a professional kind of grief for the fact that trust is fragile and sometimes weaponized. His words did not erase the fact that people had been harmed. They did not return the funds or the private paperwork we had been forced to present in court. But the confession did something unexpected. It closed a loop. For me, closure was not an end of feeling. It was the end of a question. Who did I think he was, and who had he allowed himself to become? I did not feel triumphant when I finished his letter. I felt a complicated release, like deep breath after holding a weight for too long.
Part of me wanted to respond, to voice the full ledger of consequences, to name every small hurt. But the letter itself was enough to tell me what I needed to know. He recognized his wrong. What I needed to do moving forward was not dwell in retribution, but build so the harm could not be inflicted on someone else the same way. That work, practical, stubborn, communal, became my center. We formalized the foundation board with Eleanor as legal chair, Pastor Williams as community liaison, Marcus as security advisor, and Curtis and Maria as community representatives. We hired a small staff to run workshops and manage the properties. We published a transparent budget, chose maintenance contractors locally, and set a tenant advisory committee to give residents real say in decisions. The foundation's programs grew organically. We created a Know Your Paper clinic that helped people audit their accounts and mail. We partnered with a nonprofit legal clinic to provide pro bono consultations for those who suspected fraud or needed help understanding their rights. We started a rent and repair microgrant program that covered small, urgent expenses for tenants and local small business owners so they wouldn't fall prey to predatory lenders. The workshops taught people how to freeze credit, set alerts, and spot irregularities in mail and online accounts. We taught people how to keep a simple ledger and what a suspicious transaction looks like. One of the most meaningful moments came a year after the funeral. We organized a neighborhood block party to celebrate the stabilization of the Maple House and the reopening of a small bakery that had been on the edge of closure. The Johnson family set out folding chairs. Maria brought a cake she had perfected from recipes my father used to help her adjust the oven for. Curtis did a small blessing of the porch and showed a group of kids how to sand a rung of the bench so they could help with upkeep. People laughed in ways that were not credentialed by trauma, but by ordinary relief. Standing on that porch, I looked over the faces of people my father had considered his real legacy. He had not been wealthy in the way magazines define wealth. He had been rich in relationships. The trust he had put in place had been a legal tool to protect that relational wealth financially. The foundation turned that protection into a platform for community resilience. There were practical wins. Restitution payments from civil suits paid some contractors, a partial recovery of the $47,000 owed eased the strain on the 4th Street tenant, and the Capital Reserve account balance was settled in a forensic process that reversed fraudulent charges where possible. The convictions of Brian and Vanessa meant their freedom was curtailed, and that the narrative of blame had a juridical anchoring.
Beyond the courtroom, though, our real work was building a preventative culture, teaching women and men how to spot early signs of financial abuse, running clinics that could catch identity theft within months, and giving tenants the legal language to fight improper evictions or unauthorized subleases. People sometimes ask if I forgave Brian. Forgiveness is not a simple checkbox. The letter he sent from prison was honest in parts and evasive in parts. It was in the main an expression of regret. For me, forgiveness has been an act of choosing not to let his actions define every landscape of my future. It is choosing to steward my father's legacy rather than to let the hurt shape my relationships into fearful arrangements. It is choosing to move carefully into new intimacies and to teach others how to guard what matters without closing their hearts. Regret, as he expressed it, is a private thing. It does not fix the past, but it can sometimes guide restitution and cooperation in the present. Brian's letter included an offer to cooperate with ongoing investigations and an admission that his choices were selfish. That cooperation helped Amanda and the DA's office secure certain financial records and aided in tracing the flow of funds. His remorse did not erase harm, but it provided some of the documentation prosecutors needed to finalize restitution and to show a degree of acceptance of responsibility in court. In the months that followed, the foundation became a regular part of my life. The half-and-half model, half rental income for maintenance and reserves, half for foundation programs, proved sustainable because we invested carefully in repair and tenant retention. Keeping tenants housed and small businesses afloat meant consistent rental income that didn't churn with turnover costs. We built a small endowment for the foundation to ensure program stability. We also created partnerships with local organizations to expand offerings. A bank donated a monthly credit clinic, a legal aid group staffed a weekly drop-in, and a local college offered interns to help with bookkeeping and outreach. Looking back now, the moment at the funeral when I signed the papers feels both like a wound and like a pivot. Signing was a human, emotionally reactive thing. I made that choice under pressure and sorrow. But my father's foresight with the irrevocable trust meant that legally the assets were shielded from the immediate consequences of that signature. His legal planning did not erase the pain of that day, but it gave me a place to stand and a template for what to do next. Today, the Jason and Sarah Hart Foundation runs 3 core programs: emergency rental assistance, financial literacy workshops, and a tenant advisory initiative that ensures residents have a voice in property decisions.
We publish an annual report that lists how funds were allocated, the number of people served, and stories of impact, like Maria's bakery staying open another 5 years, or a single mother avoiding eviction because of a small life-saving grant. Those stories are where the numbers meet life. They're what my father always thought of when he wired a neighbor $20 to buy groceries. The legal story closed in courtrooms and filings. The human story continued in kitchens and porches. And somewhere in that space between law and life, I found a vocation I had not expected: steward. It was not a title I sought, but it felt like an inheritance more valuable than property, a calling to hold things with care. When I read Brian's last paragraph, where he asked for nothing more than a line acknowledging his wrongs, I folded the paper and put it in the box with other correspondence from that season. The letter is neither prize nor talisman. It is a record. For me, the conclusion of the matter was not vengeance, but work, repair, accountability, and a steady outward movement toward prevention. If this story resonates with you and you want to learn practical steps to protect yourself or someone you love from financial abuse, the Jason and Sarah Hart Foundation maintains resources online, workshop recordings, checklists for spotting identity theft, and links to legal assistance. We also run regular clinics in neighborhoods like ours and invite volunteers to help run sessions. Grief changed me. So did responsibility. I learned the hard lessons of trust, the small clues to watch for, the paperwork to secure, the people to consult. I learned how legal tools can protect and how community can repair. My father's legacy is not a bank account. It is a set of practices. Fix the roof. Teach your neighbor how to read a statement. Lend a hand without expecting something in return. Those are the things that last. I still keep the photograph of Dad on the kitchen counter sometimes, and when I do, I think of the quiet way he made the world around him work better. He chose the trust because he wanted to guard not only my future, but the future of the people he loved. That choice cost him secrecy in his last hours, perhaps the burden of knowing more than I did. It also gave me a plan. I cannot change the way the petition was handed to me that day at the church, nor can I unmake the shock of that moment. What I can do, and what I have chosen to do, is to turn the aftermath into protection for others. We built a foundation not to glorify tragedy, but to prevent it. We taught workshops not to score points, but to hand people tools to keep their own lives intact. We kept rents reasonable, not to be saintly, but to honor the small, steady acts my father practiced. When you look at your own life, pay attention to small anomalies, the unexpected bills, the accounts you never opened, the questions your partner asks about other people's money. Paper the seams of your life with good practices. Keep a copy of important documents, set up alerts on accounts, and talk to a trusted attorney or financial advisor early. If you suspect identity theft, act quickly. Contact the institutions involved, consider a fraud alert, and get help from professionals who can document what has happened. My father's trust bought time and a pathway for me to do right by the people he loved. The arrests and convictions were part of legal consequence, but the restoration, real, human, neighbor to neighbor, has been the meaningful part of our recovery. We have rebuilt a small neighborhood economy that honors people over profit and teaches vigilance instead of paralyzing fear. If this story moved you and you'd like to support the work we're doing, whether by attending a workshop, volunteering, or learning more about protective financial practices, please consider subscribing to this channel and visit the Jason and Sarah Hart Foundation's website, where you can find resources, donation options, and upcoming events. We share survivor stories, practical guides, and ways to get involved so fewer people have to learn these lessons the hard way. Thank you for listening. If you are going through something similar, know you are not alone. There are people ready to help, systems that can protect you, and communities willing to stand with you. My father's last act was a practical one. Mine has been to turn that practicality into a platform so that protection is not just for one person, but for many.